Okay guys, so in this video I'm going to share a story from work, so let's get into it. So basically what we're going to cover is one of the reasons why I think it's so important that developers learn how to take part in the product development process and not to just be a yes man or yes woman, whichever you prefer, and how it becomes so important to have more than one voice in a team. Let me explain. So I'll tell you a quick story. So a while back, I was working together with a few of my coworkers, and we were discussing a feature in one of the products that we were developing. And the basics of the product was very simple. We had a form page, just like this, where you were supposed to be able to update a product, and you should be able to add a product. You should be able to just modify it. It was basically a standard CRUD application, right? And the designers that originally had designed it and then we had implemented it, of course, it looks very similar to this. You can just imagine a much more complicated UI with a lot of more information to be added and updated with these pencils. Now, each of these pencils opened up the modal, and that modal allowed you to input some information, and then you could save that information, and then we did validation, of course, and we had a bunch of business logic that was associated with this. And if it was a required field, the value would state that it was required or something like that, and then you could submit this form basically. Now, this was this page became fairly complicated over time. And I think that the original development process for making this page into what it was took about a week ish, something like that. Now, when we were redesigning this page, we were going to refactor it basically. We took it from something very similar to this. If we have a look at the original code here, so this is the code for the feature that you just saw. So I'm pulling in a few icons from Material UI, and then I have the dialog from Material UI. Created some fields in my React application here, and here is a bunch of business logic where I can set the fields, I can create this, I select the selected field, and then I have the state open or closed for the modal, and then we have the on submit, which is just basically going to go through and check, okay, so if I submit this form now, what value am I going to set, because each of these values are evaluated individually. And then I have my on click that is just going to, when I click the pen icon, I'm going to see the dialog, right? And here's the code, like the actual markup that we are generating. So this thing here is a very small example of the structure of the page that we just had. Now, the problem that I had with this when I first saw this and we were starting to talk about redesigning this or refactoring it basically, what I basically stated was, I think that we should scrap this entire thing. I think we should throw this entire page away. And I just stated, the reason why I believe that we should do that is because this is over-designed. And so my developer coworkers, they looked at me and like designer kind of went, well, what do you mean? Because they usually they can get a little bit defensive sometimes when it comes to their work. And I say, well, it's over-designed. And they go, why? What do you mean? Well, because what you're basically doing here, what you have literally done, is that you have complicated a form. This is what it is. This pen icon, like this entire user experience, like this is an internal tool by the by, where we are just using it ourselves. This is not adding anything. It's not adding any value. I'm creating an extra click here and a bunch of complicated code logic to add a field to a form. That is what I'm doing. I'm literally complicating a process that is so standard and so recognized within the industry that most people have filled out hundreds of forms by the time they are done. So why are we doing this? What value does this bring? It doesn't give us anything. So the suggestion I made was that, all right, let's simplify this. Let's think about, okay, what's the simplest thing we can do that is still going to create a good user experience? And we landed in something very similar to this. Now this is, of course, like I haven't styled this or anything like that, but this is functionally, this is identical. I can add all of this information in here and I can submit the form. There is no difference between these two experiences from a productivity and usage perspective. It is literally the same thing. I think that the re-implementation of this page, and today it's still running in production without any complaints from anybody who's using it, and everybody thinks that it works perfectly fine. I think we did this in a day, no, almost less than a day. Let's look at the code, just as in this little demo example here. This is the code to do literally the same thing. So what I'm trying to get you to understand here is that the reason why we went with this original design was because the developers themselves never actually stopped to think whether or not this makes sense. I'm not saying that this is the developer's fault. I'm saying that when the designer designed this, it was from a different perspective than from the technical perspective. And when you're dealing with different types of people who have different ideas of what to do, you could make the argument that the designer should have not overcomplicated things. But the problem is that if there's more than one person who is responsible for the delivery of the project, there is always the argument that, okay, well, I should have been smart enough to see this beforehand before I made this implementation. And then you can also make the argument, well, my teammates were reviewing it, and the developers, they could have said no. They could have given feedback on this and said that, oh, well, this is just a lot of extra complication for basically submitting a form. And there's no right or wrong answer here. There's no one who's more responsible than somebody else necessarily. So you need to work together. And that's why you should have different perspectives on the same thing. Ideally, you should have people who represent different voices in the conversation. So if the designers are supposed to represent the ideal user experience, well, then the developers, they need another perspective. Because if they have the exact same perspective, or they just say yes to everything the designers want, odds are that you will create a really shitty system. I've seen this many times before, where there's something that the designers want, or the non-technical stakeholders are after, that is really hard to build in a sustainable way. And that is a key thing. Because I promise you here and now, no one wants a feature that looks amazing but never works. That's just going to cause a lot of frustration and anger for everybody involved. And as the technical person, that is your most natural viewpoint. Your most natural viewpoint should be, how can I give my stakeholders what they want without compromising the stability and accuracy of my system? That is what you're going for. So if the designer is going for the ideal user experience, you should go for the most stable and well-functioning system that you can possibly make. And if you can collaborate and see and communicate effectively, you will reach a very nice middle ground. And the honest-to-God answer to what happened here in my story was that people are today much more happy. Everybody's happier with this approach, and all it required us was to take a different perspective on things. All that had to happen was for one developer to go in and say, you know what, this is more complicated. Instead of being the yes person, instead of being the person who goes, oh yeah, I don't care really, I mean, this is what they want, and yeah, that's really, really tricky, but for some reason, instead of telling my stakeholders that this is going to make a really shitty system, I just go with the flow. And if you always go with the flow, then you're not doing your job. Your job is to be the technical expert. You need to be able to stand up and say, you know what? I think that this, from a technical perspective, is going to be a lot more complicated, or it's going to be unsustainable. It's going to be this, and that. And voice that. If it does turn out that your stakeholders don't care and they just mow over you with their own opinions, well, then at least you tried. But this is what you need to be for the best outcome to happen. It is what you have to become in order to guarantee that the project is going to be sustainable. Nothing creates a legacy and problems as quickly as a developer who will only blindly do whatever is on the piece of paper that says what they need to do. That is what a code monkey does, and that is what will cause a really shitty system. So what I want you to take away from this is that a overcomplicated feature such as this, you might run into these things where you see that, why are we making this so complicated, or why someone is asking you to build something that is, technologically very unsustainable. You might have to do a lot of ugly hacks and stuff like that to make it work. Communicate that. You have to communicate it, because I promise you, unless you are so confident that you can solve this thing in a way that makes it sustainable, you're going to have problems. And at the end of the day, in this scenario, what's going to happen is that it's you who are going to stand there at the end of the day with the shitty system that you need to maintain. Everybody's going to be frustrated with the system that you built, and you are the one who is responsible for maintaining it. You're like the one who has to fix it. The designer, all they're going to do is that they're going to design something and then they're going to move on. In this scenario, you're very much like someone who has a one-night stand with some douchebag and then gets you pregnant and then fucks off. That's literally what's going to happen, because you're the one who's going to have to deal with the outcome of that interaction. The other person is just going to move on to the next project. So keep that with you. Don't just be a yes programmer. Really think about what's best for the system before you say yes to a feature that someone puts in your lab, and have a dialogue with the people that you are collaborating with, so that the project both becomes a really great user experience and also so stable that you can depend on the system. Have a great day.